Welcome, everyone, to the Fall 2021 Centered Life series. Um, we are very pleased that you're with us. We're very enthused by the theme for this year, which is a little different in format than we've done in years past. As you know, because of the limitations of the pandemic, we've continued to do these virtual presentations, and in hopes at one point we can do a combination, but time will tell whether that is going to happen or not. We're going to do 2 4-week sessions this year, every Wednesday in the month of November, and then following that we'll be doing another 4-week series in February of this year. It's a little different this fall because we're asking 2 of our very gifted staff and faculty at Augsburg University to present some of the work that they've been doing over the last 5 years, actually. And it's been work around what's the future of the congregation in the present circumstances in which we live. And these circumstances go way before the pandemic, but it's the growing awareness that the church on the local street corner needs to re-envision itself to be more appropriately, have more appropriate impact on the communities in which they serve. And so the research that's been done at Augsburg University has been through Lily, who's given us now we're a 5-year grant to really explore what is the role of the church in the public square. How do we enter into the complexities of this world and listen to God's call to be neighbor in the particular places in which we find ourselves? As you know, church was always defined by Luther not by the building on the street corner, but God's people, God's baptized that come together to gather in order to scatter. And at a time like this in our history where so much is frayed around us, the need for our congregations and communities of faith to reach out into the public square has become not a luxury, but a critical thing in which we need to do our work. So these 4 weeks we'll be exploring the research that Jeremy and Christina have done, but more than just the research, it will point to their findings and really their convictions around what they've learned about the church of the future. So without further ado, I want to introduce you the 2 that will be leading these 4 weeks. Dr. Jeremy Myers is Associate Professor of Religion and is Executive Director of the Christensen Center Vocation. He's been a member of the Religion Department at Augsburg University since 2006, and with specific responsibilities for facilitating the university's theology and public leadership degree program, the Youth Studies minor, and the Augsburg Youth Theology Institute. Jeremy comes with vast experience, and coupled with being an excellent researcher, we're very enthused to hear what Jeremy has to say about this work. He partners with Christina Fruge, and she's the managing director of the Christensen Center for Vocation. She's been with the center in various capacities since June 2017. She was the project director for the Riverside Innovation Hub and is now the managing director of the Christensen Center for Vocation. Prior to joining Augsburg Riverside Innovation Hub, Christina spent 15 years working and serving as a social worker, youth director, and community networker at the intersections of congregations and their greater communities. So the theme is fruit for thought, fruit for food, and leaves for healing, a faith for the sake of the world. And so before we actually begin, Jeremy and Christina, with your formal presentation, could you give us a few words about your own personal convictions that have driven this work because we know behind this is not simply an academic exercise, but both of you live personally in communities and are part of the communities of faith. So welcome, both of you, and love to hear a little bit about your passion for this work.
Thanks, Jack, and hello to everyone out there. I can't see you all, but I'm hoping you're there. Christina, do you want to take that first, and then I'll pick it up after that?
I can give it a try. So yes, as Jack said, my name is Christina Fruge. I have been at Augsburg for just 4 or 5 years now, coming in to do this work, made possible through some funding with the Lilly Endowment, which a lot of this has been kind of Jeremy's brainchild. So you'll hear him share maybe a little bit more about the specific ways we're engaging in this work with congregations in the neighborhood. But for me personally, there's a lot I could say. I'll just share one little story. Back in my earlier days of doing community-based work in congregational settings, I had a conversation with my oldest son, who was 5 at the time. We were talking about what people did for their jobs when they went to work, and I asked him if he knew what I did when I went to work, and he was like, "Well, yeah, Mom, you work for love. That's what the church does." So that was a pretty powerful statement from young William, and it was really kind of grounding for me, doing work that sometimes I have a difficult time explaining exactly what it is that I do. And so that was a very helpful way to articulate, like, truly at the end of the day, that's why I'm here doing this work. And I'm doing this work for love, particularly with congregations and through the avenue of Augsburg University, because those are the spheres of influence that I've been able to find myself in. I think a lot of folks work for love outside of the church in a lot of different places and in a lot of important ways. I just happen to have put a lot of my time and energy into congregational settings over the years. So that's what I know. And I believe we have a really deep and powerful story that compels us to participate in that story in a way that is about working for love in our neighborhoods and in our places and in the spheres of influence that we have around us. So I'm going to stop there because I could probably ramble on.
Thank you so much, Christina. Jeremy.
Yeah, for me, my background, before I came to Augsburg, I was a youth minister at a church in Fridley, Minnesota, and Valparaiso, Indiana, and then I went back and did my PhD. So my area of research and study and teaching primarily has not only has it been ministry, but specifically ministry with young people, so children, youth, families, young adults. And the work we're going to share with you over these next 4 weeks really grew out of me trying to think of a particular way to approach confirmation or faith formation or discipleship with young people that started with their own experiences rather than starting with the small catechism or the Bible. Not that those aren't important. I think they're absolutely critical, but I think sometimes we start with those things and our young people never learn how to see the things we confess as Christians as tools that help them think about life and help them understand life. And so I was trying to find a way, how can I work with young people in a way that would get them engaged in their community, listening to their neighbors, and then coming to me or to their pastor, to their church with questions about what they're encountering in daily life. And then how do we come alongside of them and those questions with scripture, with the small catechism, with our core beliefs as a way of helping them think in ways about what they're encountering in their daily lives. And as I started to experiment with this and explore with it and work with some other youth ministers around it, I started to hear other people say, you know, what you're talking about really isn't just for young people. This is what matters for all people in the church. And so what has become important to me is the intersection between how we live and the things we believe about God's promises. And how do we, if we really believe in these things we say about God, then how do those impact our daily lives and how we show up in the world? Not in a legalistic way, but in a grace-filled, set-free, good news sort of way. And how can we use that interaction between God's promises and our daily lives as a place to help people learn, whether they're 16 or 76? How do we use that intersection as a place where people can learn how to live out their faith on a daily basis?
Great, Jeremy. You've already given us one mini lecture, which is phenomenal, in just understanding how you come to this work. So both of you, thank you. And thank you for coming at this work differently. I'm sure the dynamic between the two of you in conversation and the work that you do together, probably 1 + 1 = 3 or 4, not just simply an addition. So thank you for that. Just want to remind people as we begin this series that all of this is being recorded and will be available to people. And I'm going to also, what I just put on the screen right now is just let you see that not only are we recording the work, but also want you to know that during the time that the presentation is being made, we want to entertain any questions you might have. And so we ask you to use that chat format at the bottom of your screen. And this is just an explanation of that. And also know that we have closed captioning and how that comes about. Each of these sessions will be a standalone experience, but they also are connected in a very vital way. And so there's real benefit for you to, if you're unable to come to a given part of the series, that you check in the recordings. And I think we're going to be a little delayed in those recordings. I think it's going to be 7 to 10 days. Is that right, Amy?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So, but at any rate, you can catch up if you need to, and know that and finally, just as we begin to remind you that last year you were able to sign up for all of them at one time. We're not doing that this year at this point. So unfortunately, you're going to have to go back in and make sure you sign up for each of the 4 times so that you can be assured that you'll get the announcement the day previous to remind you of the series. So with that little bit of information, I'm eager to get into your first presentation. So I turn it back to the two of you to give us your presentation as you wish.
Great, thanks, Jack. And our strategy moving forward, really, I'm going to be the main presenter today, and then the next 2 weeks, Christina and I will tag team those presentations, and then Christina will be the main presenter in the last session. So I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to listen to me today, and you'll get the better half next week. Also, TJ is running the slides for me because my computer has been acting a little weird, so I'll have to ask him to advance the slides throughout the presentation. So I apologize now for that clumsiness. But TJ, if you wouldn't mind clicking it to the next one, this is where I'd like to start with you all. This is a quote by a Canadian theologian named Douglas John Hall, and let me read it to you and then unpack it for you, because I find it to be extremely helpful for our work. Theology is that ongoing activity of the whole church that aims at clarifying what gospel must mean here and now. The good news is good because it challenges and displaces the bad news. My father was a pastor, and I remember him telling me that if the church lost everything, the one thing it can never lose is the good news. The one thing that makes the church different than everything else, any other organization, is the good news. that the church always shows up with good news. And I love this quote by Douglas John Hall, because he talks about theology as being the work of the congregation. But two, he talks about it as this work that happens at the intersection, where good news intersects with bad news. And when I hear this statement, it tells me that good news is good because it challenges and displaces something that's actually bad news. And so if I want to show up in the world with good news for my neighbor, which I deeply want to be able to do, if I want to be able to show up in the world with good news for my neighbor, then that means I have to do the hard work of understanding my neighbor's bad news. If I want the good news to really be good for them, and if I want the good news to really be news for them, then I have to hear how they're encountering bad news in their life. What is it that holds them in bondage? How are they captive? And then I might know, if I know that, then I might know what freedom would sound like to them. Then I might know what reconciliation would sound like to them. Then I might know what resurrection might sound like to them, if I understand what death sounds like to them, if I understand what bondage sounds like to them. And so this idea of this work that we're going to talk about over the next 4 weeks is really a process that we've created to help individuals and congregations begin to do that slow, hard work of listening to the bad news of our neighbors so that we might proclaim good news to them. I will also say that I think, as a Christian, I think the good news is absolutely always Jesus. But I think Jesus shows up differently in different places at different times, given the bad news that's present. But I do believe that that's always Jesus, the incarnate Word of God that shows up as good news in a way it needs to show up because of the bad news that's being encountered. And TJ, if you can switch slides, I'll share our goal. This is our goal for these 4 sessions. We hope that at the end of these 4 weeks, that you will find ways to live your lives so that your lives are informed and transformed by your neighbor's reality and God's promises, the intersection of those two things. We hope that by the end of these 4 weeks, you'll have some ways of becoming engaged with your neighbor, becoming engaged with God's promises in new ways that are both that would transform you and the communities you live in. So let's move on. And in order for people to learn how to live lives like that, our argument is that what they need are what we call public churches. So we use this phrase, we use this term public church to mean a particular thing. A public church, we don't think we can have public Christians without public churches, because being a public Christian, someone who's deeply engaged with their neighbors, someone who's theologically, thoughtfully reflective on their neighbors' experiences, someone who's discerning how God is calling them to show up as good news in their neighbors' lives, and someone who's actually doing the work of showing up as good news in their lives. To do that, to be a public Christian in that way, is really hard work. And it's hard for us to do on our own. And we do this, we learn how to do this work, and we find support for doing this work in community. So if we want people learning how to live out the good news of Jesus in their daily lives, then we need churches who are teaching people how to live out the good news of Jesus in their daily lives. And we would call those churches public churches. So a public church is a church that is engaged in its context, engaged in its neighborhood, engaged in its town, in a way that it's listening to its neighbors so that it might know how the church can show up in its community as good news for the sake of their neighbors. That's what we mean when we say public church. So these 4 weeks will be, today is going to be mostly me telling you why do we need public churches? Why should we become public as a church? So today is me giving you more of the theological and theoretical reasons why we should be a public church. And then the next 2 weeks are going to be us telling you how we can actually go about the work of being a public church. And then the 4th week, we're actually going to zoom in on you personally and help you think about what does this mean for me? How can I do this as an individual and in my own life? How can I put some of these things into practice as an individual? So that's our plan for the next 4 weeks. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to outline my presentation for you today. There's three things I really want to do, 3 segments to this presentation coming up here in the next few minutes. I'm going to share one biblical image with you that helps us understand why we should become public. I'm going to share 4 theological claims with you for why we should become public. And then I'm going to share one big reality check with you for why we should become public. And we often want to start at the reality check, but we're going to save that for last. So if we can move on to the biblical image, and I'm going to just read this to you. You're welcome to just listen and follow along. Listen, close your eyes and listen if you would like to, and visualize the text, or you can read the words on your screen and follow along as I read them. This is a vision from Ezekiel. Ezekiel encounters we call him a divine tour guide, who's giving Ezekiel a tour of the temple, and then he takes Ezekiel outside of the temple as well. And this vision of Ezekiel becomes an image, a metaphor with a lot of power for us as we think about our work. And so I'm going to read these verses to you. And as I read through it, I'm also going to give some commentary and unpack why these are such powerful verses for our work and such a powerful image for the church. So this is from Ezekiel chapter 47. Then he is this divine tour guide that Ezekiel has encountered. Then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple. There, water was flowing from below the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water, just for reference, this means the water is flowing from the temple into the wilderness. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces towards the east. And the water was coming out on the south side. So coming out on the east and the south side, flowing towards the wilderness. Going on eastward with a cord in his hand, this is the divine tour guide again, the man measured 1,000 cubits. Then he led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again, he measured 1,000 cubits and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again, he measured 1,000, led me through the water, and it was up to my waist. Again, he measured 1,000, and it was a river I could not cross, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be crossed. He turned to me and he said, "Mortal, have you seen this?" I'm going to pause there. I'll keep reading here in a minute. TJ, if you can go back one. Yeah, great. Thank you. As the river flows further from the temple, it gets deeper and it gets wider. As the river of life, as God's mercy flows further from the temple, it gets deeper and it gets wider. The temple can't contain this water. The temple can't contain this life. The temple can't contain God's abundance, God's mercy. It flows from the temple into the world, into the wilderness. The further away it gets from the temple, it gets deeper and it gets wider. And then this question, have you seen this? is a beautiful question that we try to keep in front of ourselves and in front of our congregations and in front of the ministry leaders we work with. Always asking each other and always wondering do we have eyes to see the breadth and the depth of God's mercy turned loose in the wilderness? And how do we as people of faith tune our vision so that we can begin to see the depth and the breadth of God's abundant mercy turned loose in the wilderness? All right, TJ, we can go to the next one. Then he led me back along the bank of the river. As I came back, I saw on the bank of the river a great many trees on one side and on the other. He said to me, "This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Araba. And when it enters the sea of stagnant waters," that's the Dead Sea, "the waters will become fresh. Wherever this river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish once these waters reach there. It will become fresh, and everything will live where the river goes. People will stand fishing beside the sea from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of a great many kind, like the fish of the great sea." God's mercy and God's abundance brings life, and it brings diversity of life. But its swamps and its marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. On the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. And this is where the title of this series comes from. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail. Now, this is a nod to verses in Jeremiah, Isaiah, Genesis, and Revelation that all talk about the tree of life. Not growing anxious in a time of drought, but always producing fruit, never withering, even in a time of drought. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. So this vision of Ezekiel becomes a powerful, powerful vision for us as we do this work. When we say, why must the church become public? We look at old texts like this and we say, because God's mercy, God's abundant mercy wants to be public. It does not want to be bound up in the temple. It flows towards the wilderness, and where it goes, it brings life. And not only does it bring life, but it brings life that produces fruit for food and leaves for healing. And I think of those trees along the banks of the river are images for us of congregations. God's mercy flowing to these congregations, God's mercy flowing to individuals who then produce fruit for food and leaves for healing. How is God's mercy flowing into our lives in a way that causes us to generate fruit and leaves that are for the neighbor, for food and for healing? So one reason why we do this work is because of rich images of God's work that we have in scriptures like this one from Ezekiel. So that's my one biblical image I wanted to share with you. Now I want to share my 4 theological claims with you. So we can click to the next slide, TJ. Some would say, we are not trying to propose to you a new, hip, cool way to do church. That's not what we're trying to propose here. I remember when I was in ministry, I got tired of all the glossy brochures that came through the mail to me telling me a conference I could go. I remember in the 90s, there were conferences you could go to learn how to use your Franklin Covey day planner to better run your church. We're not doing that here. What we're talking about here is not just becoming public because it's cool, but becoming public because it's true to who God is, right? We have this biblical image from Ezekiel of God's abundant mercy flowing out into the wilderness towards the public. It's true to who God is as Trinity. God, as Christians, we confess that God is three in one. So at the center of God's identity is a relationship. At the center of who God is a relationship. So then God creates God's people to be in relationship, and God creates God's institutions to be in relationship. So we move out into the public square to enter into relationships with our neighbor because it's true to who God is. God is at the core of relationship. We are not created to be in isolation. We are created to bump up against one another and be in relationship with one another. So it's true to who God is as Trinity. If we can move to the next slide. It's also true to who God is as incarnation. The God we confess as Christians is a God who shows up in our space, in flesh and blood, in Jesus. The Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. So when we move into the world and dwell with our neighbors, we are living a life that is true to who God is. It's true to who God is as Trinity. It's true to who God is as the incarnation, the one who shows up in our neighborhood and camps out there. Not only is it true to who God is as incarnation, it's also true to who we are. You'll move to the next slide. As ones who are created in God's image. This relational God who creates for relationship, who enters into that relationship through incarnation, then also creates us in God's image. I remember the two youth ministry positions I held, the one here in Minnesota and one in Indiana, how excited I would get, and the young people that I worked with also, well, how excited I got when I started to think about what could ministry look like beyond the walls of the church. And when I started to roam around the community and wonder, what could we be doing here? What could we be doing there? Who are the people we could be partnering with? It was very exciting. And sometimes I thought, well, maybe this is just the way I prefer to do ministry. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe I'm just talking about personal preferences here. When we would do service work or mission trips with the young people that I worked with, they would, in fact, there was a young man sitting in my office here the other day from Duluth, and he was talking to me about service projects and how amazing it felt to be doing that work. And when he was at a national youth gathering, they were doing a day of service, and they were cleaning up a park, and then these two women who worked for the park service showed up and came over and started working alongside of them. And he said, "You don't need to do this. We're here to volunteer." And they're like, "No, this is what we do." And so they spent all day working alongside of him. And as he unpacked the meaningfulness of that experience for me, it was less about the work they did and way more about the relationship that he developed with these two women from the park service who came out to work alongside of them. And so then he and I talked a little bit about, well, maybe that's just your personal preference. Maybe you just like to work with people. But what I think it is I think it's actually the way we're wired. I think we're actually wired, created for these relationships, created to be connected to people in this way. We weren't created to be isolated. We were created to be in partnership, in relationship with one another. So we do this work because it's true to who God is as a relational God. It's true to who God is as an incarnate God who enters into our space. We do this work because it's true to who we are as people who have been created in the image of that God. And then the fourth theological claim I would like to make on the next slide is that it's true to who we are as people of vocation. That we have been, this love of Christ sets us free to live our lives for the sake of our neighbor. Not to earn any points with God. As Luther would say, God doesn't need our good works in heaven. Our neighbor needs our good works here on earth. And so this movement out into the community is a movement into vocation. How do we hear our neighbor's bad news so that we might show up as good news set free by God in their lives. So it's true to who God is, and it's true to who we are as people seeking out vocation. When I was doing my dissertation at Luther Seminary, my research was on, I traveled around the country and I interviewed young people talk about how they experience God in their lives. So I asked them to tell me about a time when they thought they really encountered God, when they thought God was doing something special in their lives. And one thing that I discovered from that research was that the language they used was vocation language, not salvation language. So these young people talked about their experiences with God as a God who calls, not as a God who saves. That doesn't mean they don't think God saves. What it means is that the primary experiences they've had in their life, that they would identify as experiences of God's work in their life, they would identify those moments as moments of vocation. They didn't use that word, but they talked about feeling a deeper sense of responsibility for the neighbor, feeling a deeper sense of stewardship for creation, feeling a sense of smallness in the cosmos, but still cared for by God. He used language like that talked about, it was all relational language, connected to my neighbor, connected to creation, connected to God. They didn't talk about being saved. They talk about being called into living life in a particular way. So there right there real quickly you can write a book on each one of these 4 things or 20 books. But right there, those are 4 theological claims for why we need to become public. But now what I want to share on the next slide is sort of the one reality check. We would say that going public is also necessary because people aren't going to church anymore. And that's where we usually start, right? That's usually where we start the conversation. People aren't going to church anymore. So here's a new model of church that'll get everyone to come back. That's not what we're selling here. If you can click it one more time, TJ, you'll see a summary of some findings from Gallup that were released this spring. This is the percentage of U.S. adults that said yes to this question. Do you happen to be a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque? The percentage that said yes in 2020 for the first time ever dropped below 50%. 47% of adults in the United States would say, yes, I'm a member of a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. So another reason why we must become public is because people aren't coming to church anymore. And we can sit here and mope about it, and we can sit here and be angry about it, or we can accept the fact that we still have good work to do, that God still has God's mission, and that we are a part of that. And if we want our neighbors to encounter good news, we're actually going to have to go out to where they're living their lives, because we can't sit back and wait any longer for these folks to come to church. And now, post-COVID, if any of you in this audience are pastors, post-COVID, I imagine these numbers feel even more bleak. Online worship maybe was a blessing, and now maybe it's hard to get people to come back in person. Folks that were barely hanging on to a church community have now maybe completely lost connection to that church community, or people who live busy lives have now found out that it's kind of nice to have Sunday mornings available to run errands to Home Depot. And so the reality of getting people to come back to church is looking less and less likely. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with a retired pastor who was talking about, he was quoting a friend of his, or maybe even a mentor of his, who talked about how easy it was to do church planting in the 1950s. He said that this friend of his would say, or he told his friend, all you have to do is open the door and turn on the lights. And his friend just kind of paused and sat there and said, I don't know if I even had to turn on the lights. All you had to do was open the door and people would show up. Maybe we didn't even need to turn on the lights. It's harder these days to get people plugged into church. So if we believe we still have good news that's of value for people in our world, then we're going to have to do the work of going to them rather than waiting for them to come to us. So those are some of the reasons why we think the church needs to become public, because there are rich images in Scripture about God and God's mercy being public. Jesus was public because it's true to who God is, because it's true to who we are, and because it's a necessity looking at these very real numbers that we face today. So, what I want to do now is share in the next the last few minutes of this presentation, I want to share with you the model that we're using here at Augsburg that we're going to describe to you over the next couple weeks, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end of our time together. This wheel in front of you, this cycle in front of you, this cycle of arrows in front of you represents a cyclical process, which is the model that we're using here at Augsburg. So it starts with accompaniment. It moves into interpretation. From there, it moves into discernment. And from there, it moves into proclamation. I'm saying that just so you see the movement around the circle. And now I'm going to briefly describe each one of these things. And let me just say this, too. We did not invent this. This is not rocket science. We don't own this. This is common sense. This is the work we all do in our daily lives already. And all we're asking individuals to do, and all we're asking congregations to do, is to be intentional about these movements. To be intentional about these movements as expressions of our belief, of our faith in God, and as opportunities to form people to live out their faith in daily life. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a special formula. If you read any literature on experiential education, you're going to see a similar process. If you read any literature on what they call practical theology, you're going to see a similar process. If any of you preach on a regular basis, my hunch is that you already go through these steps when you're preparing a sermon. And now what we're trying to do, like I said, is to get congregations to do this work collectively, intentionally. So let me explain them briefly, and then we're going to go into more depth over the next few weeks with them. The movement, or we call these art forms, and we call this model the public church framework. That's just the phrase we use for it. This is the public church framework, and we call these movements art forms. And the reason why we use the word art form is because ultimately we don't think it really matters how you do these things. It just matters that you do them. So if you were a sculptor and I was a sculptor, but you sculpted in stone and you went for realism, and I sculpted using the garbage that I pull out of the Mississippi River, and I kind of go for abstract art, you wouldn't necessarily look at my art and say, that's not art, you're not a sculptor. And I wouldn't look at your art and say, that's not art, you're not a sculptor. We would recognize that we're both sculptors and we do it differently. We use different mediums, we use different tools, we create things that look different, but it's still sculpting. So how you practice accompaniment depends on the gifts of your own gifts, the gifts of your congregation. How you practice accompaniment depends on the community, the context that you're in. We're all going to do this differently, but what matters is that you do it. So what do we mean by accompaniment? We mean engaging with your neighbor so that you begin to hear your neighbor's story, so that you might start to understand what are their hopes and their dreams? What do they hope? What do they hope for? What kind of life do they hope to live in the community that you share together? How do they experience fear, suffering, isolation, brokenness in their daily lives? How do they experience hope, reconciliation, resurrection in their lives? The first step for a public church, the first step for a public Christian is to engage with the neighbor, to learn who the neighbor is, to learn their story with no strings attached. This is not market research. You're not trying to find out from your neighbor what they want your church to do so that they'll come back to church. You simply want to know your neighbor. That's accompaniment. Walking with the neighbor, hearing their story, knowing their story. But the neighbor's story isn't the only thing that matters in this process. From there, we move into this interpretive art form, where we begin to wonder about our neighbor's story in light of God's promises. So we say on a regular basis, we believe these things about who God is. How do these things we say we believe about God impact how we understand what we're hearing in our neighbor's story? Do the promises we believe in, do God's promises that we believe in change the way we think about our neighbor's story? And vice versa. Is our neighbor's story maybe challenging or pushing back against or changing the way we think about God? So the interpretive movement, the interpretive moment is when we start to wonder, how do I think theologically? How do I think about my neighbor's story in light of who I say God is? And how do I think about God in light of what I just learned from my neighbor? That intersection is the intersection I think we're all longing for. And we call that intersection wisdom. How do you take knowledge and experience and put those together so that knowledge helps you understand experience? When you can take the things you know to be true and use them to better understand experience, that's wisdom. And I think that's what we're all longing for. There's research that's been done that says that's what young people want the most from their churches is wisdom. Don't just create experiences for me, and don't just give me knowledge, but teach me how to use that knowledge to understand experiences. So we listen to the neighbor's story, we think about it theologically in light of God's promises, and then from there we move into discernment. And discernment is this movement into communal, contemplative wondering about what it is that God might be calling us to. Who is God calling us to be, and what is God calling us to do in light of what we've heard from our neighbor, in light of what we believe about God? Imagine your congregation working through, or your community of friends, or you and your family working through this together, where regularly you come back together asking one another that question. Who do we think it is that God's calling us to be right now? If we want to have individual people learning how to do this work in their daily lives, we have to do it collectively as congregations, as faith communities, so that we can all learn how to do this, because this is hard work, and it's easy work to ignore. So the third movement is this movement into discernment. And one thing we like to say is that discernment is not decision making. You're not just making a decision. The image I use is like when you would go, if you ever went out to South Dakota or out west and did panning for gold at one of those roads, at Wall Drug, I imagine Wall Drug, you could probably pay to pan for gold, right? If you ever did anything like that, you're panning for gold. You're looking for that one shiny nugget, the one thing you're like, yes, I think I could be wrong. And this is where Christian freedom comes in again. We could be wrong. We could be totally wrong. But we think this is what God's inviting us to do in the moment, given what we've heard. And then from there, we move into proclamation, where this is the movement. This is where the fruit for food and the leaves for healing happens. This is when we've listened to our neighbor. We've thought about our neighbor's story in light of God's promises. We've discerned how we think God's inviting us to show up in this moment. And now we re-engage with that fruit for food, with those leaves for healing, with good news that's good and news, because it's displacing or challenging our neighbor's bad news. Again, these are movements that we think the church is already doing. These are movements we think many pastors are already doing. And what we're asking is that congregations begin to do these intentionally so that people learn how to do them in their own lives. If we go to the last slide, and then we'll do Q&A after this last slide. This last slide just shows you where we're going, okay? So number one, this first session, I was giving you a little bit of the theological background for why we think we need to become public and what we mean by being a public church or being a public Christian. Next week, we're going to talk about those first two art forms, accompaniment and interpretation. The week after that, we'll talk about the next two art forms, discernment and proclamation. We want you to be thinking about how can your congregations do this? And then in the fourth session, we're going to talk about how might you do this as an individual or as a family. So that's our strategy moving forward over the next 4 weeks. And I am going to stop talking so that we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. You gave us a ton to think about. And one of the first questions early on was people kind of wanting clarity about some definitions, which I think this whole first section is kind of laying out the vocabulary you'll be using and some clarity around that. But one of the first questions was, can you give a more full definition of public church?
Yeah, I'm hoping that question was asked before I tried to describe it, but I'll try and describe it again.
Yeah, maybe as a summary statement now.
Yeah, absolutely. A public church, I think there are lots of different ways to think about a public church. Let me just say that, there are some people who would say a public church is public because the pastor's public. So the pastor's marching in marches or maybe they host, I often think of the church as being political. Or they might think that a public church is a denomination that is writing social statements. So the ELCA has a lot of social statements that they've written. So many people would say that's the public arm of the church. What we mean when we say public is that your local congregation is rooted in its neighborhood, that your congregation's location, your congregation's place matters, and that your congregation is doing the work of meeting people and other institutions in its neighborhood so that the church might be a good neighbor in that neighborhood. So it's the way we talk about being public is a little different than the way it's often thought of.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And another definition, maybe sometimes people think neighbors are friends, and I've often made the distinction that a friend is someone you choose. A neighbor is someone who shows up. I didn't choose the neighbors in my neighborhood,
right?
But they're people now who I'm relating to, and that's a big difference. Serving my friends is easy. Yeah. Serving my neighbor isn't always easy because I didn't choose them, and I just received them. Could you say a little more about that? Because you use the word neighbor.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I appreciate that. Yeah, you're right. I think not only is it not easy to serve the neighbor, but it's also hard to get to know the neighbor, right? So where do you even begin when you don't even know this person? We also, when we use the term neighbor, we use that term sort of broadly to mean lots of things. So it could actually be your next door neighbor. It could also be, your neighbor could be the school district. Your neighbor could be the watershed that your church is in, or maybe the farmland that surrounds your church, right? So, for example, one congregation we were working with recently in our project that we did these last 5 years, they identified the land that their church was on as the neighbor that they were going to listen to. And they did a lot of permaculture work. Their land is on a hillside between a neighborhood and a protected wetland. And so all the pollutants that were in the neighborhood would wash down into the protected wetland over this church's property. And the church asked itself, what would it mean if we thought of the land that we're on as our neighbor? What would it look like to listen to the land as our neighbor? And how might we rework the land that we're on in a way that it protects that wetland below us and captures the runoff from our neighborhood so that the pollutants from our neighborhood don't ruin the protected wetland below. So yeah, your neighbor is, Gustav Wingren is this Swedish theologian who I like and I quote a lot, and he says the call of the church is the need of the neighbor who's knocking on your door at that moment. So your neighbor is the one at that moment.
Oh.
And so your neighbor is the one who is placing demands on you. And then Bonhoeffer says, you're not in, and I'm paraphrasing now, but he says, you're not in real Christian community unless there's at least one person there who annoys you.
Yeah.
So your neighbor places demands on you, whether you want those demands placed on you or not.
Oh. I feel that sometimes going to church, we go to a fairly large church and a lot of people I don't know. But one of the things that going to church, gathering together, is I'm realizing what diversity of people God loves. Because I look around that group and I think there's a whole bunch of them I wouldn't want a vacation with. and what it does is it expands my awareness of the diversity of life that God's love demands that I somehow encounter. Amy, is taking some of the questions, but Amy, you've also developed your own questions. So I'll let you ask that question directly, if you will.
Yeah, so actually this is not my question. I'm just copying it into the chat for you.
Oh, okay.
The question is, while rightly naming good news as that which displaces our neighbor's bad news, how do we avoid thinking about our neighbor as networks of need, which can often be dehumanizing and limiting?
Yep, totally. And we talk a lot about that in the work that we do. I care deeply about a world that's broken. I think the church cares deeply about a world that's broken. But this world that's broken is also a world that's healing. And so there are times where you will encounter when you encounter your neighbor, you will realize that there are ways in which you might proclaim good news into your neighbor's life, and you will realize that there are ways in which your neighbor is going to flip it, role reversal on you. And so how do we control for that? We control for that through accompaniment. If we can help people understand what accompaniment really is, which is showing up simply to befriend and engage the neighbor, then you start to understand in those interactions with your neighbor. Then the whole premise of this is that you're invited into this collective work together with your neighbor to bring about resurrection or to participate in resurrection that might already be happening in the community. But it's not you showing up at the neighbor's door saying, I have something for you. But it's you showing up at your neighbor's door saying, who are you? What are you about? And then collectively together, you might realize what you have together. You might realize what you're lacking together. And then we do this work together in relationship. And so I love that question, totally important to this process. And we hope that if we can teach people how to practice accompaniment the way we believe it should be practiced, that sort of controls for some of that paternalistic approach to this work.
Can I add to that, Jeremy?
Yes, of course.
I think there's another potential thing that one might encounter in that work of accompaniment, and that might be that I learn or I hear that I'm part of the bad news, or the way my church is functioning, or the way I'm showing up in the world has actually been bad news for my neighbor. And so there's, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you're going to hear in this kind of posture of being open to listening, to hear where's their good news, where's their bad news. It's not like any one entity is possessing all or one of those. And so needing to be vulnerable to recognizing that sometimes the church, or me personally, I might be part of the bad news. And so then, but then still moving that through, well, if this is what I'm hearing from my neighbor, and these are the things that I believe to be true about who God is, then maybe what I discern is I need to step out of the way. Or in the example of the church that Jeremy mentioned, maybe the realization was that we're helping pollutants come through our property and pollute this watershed below us. So what are we going to do about that? So I think it's a really important question that just lifts up how dynamic it is in this exploration of where's God's good news showing up and where's their bad news, and how do we align ourselves more with God's good purposes.
Thank you. I would like to ask either one of you, I think you mentioned kind of in passing, but I thought was very notable, was how vocation, the sense of calling, is often the first way some people experience God, a sense of purpose in their life, a sense of calling. What's the purpose of my life? What am I up to? How do I contribute? How do I not just leech off society? And that provokes questions around faith. Can you say more about that work? Because I think vocation is a common entry point for having conversations about God's love and God's presence in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more people today experience anxiety around call and purpose and meaning in life than they do around eternal damnation and death. And so most people today, I don't think, are worrying on a daily basis about whether they'll be saved. Most people on a daily basis are worrying about, what's my purpose? Is my life meaningful? Am I doing enough? So these are questions about vocation and how do I show up in the world as someone who has something to offer? And what I worry about is that if we as a Christian church aren't careful, we can leverage that anxiety and manipulate it. And make it really legalistic. And all of a sudden now people are doing good things to try and find meaning in their life, and so then it becomes really self-serving, right? Which is where vocation comes in. If we can talk about this life of meaningfulness, this life of public engagement vocationally, if we can talk about it as the thing we've been not only created for, but set free for. This is the thing Christ set us free for. Then it's not a legalistic thing. Then they're, if we can convince them that the God in whose image you were created wired you for this life, and now you're free to live this life. So roll up your sleeves and do what your neighbor needs you to do, not for God's sake, but for your neighbor's sake. And so I think a lot more people are asking vocation questions and salvation questions, but what I worry about is that they wouldn't call them vocation questions, they're meaning and purpose questions. And if we're not careful, we can turn their anxiety around meaning and purpose into a real legalistic experience for them. Now I have to do these things to find meaning and purpose, rather than this is what it looks like and feels like to live into freedom and grace and mercy and abundance.
Without God's presence, a sense of God's grace, it becomes, for me, not only legalism, but rugged individualism. It's also my responsibility to somehow gather up the resources to do that, versus depending on God's love and faith in the community to
absolutely
go together.
And then you're kind of running into what that last question was about, where you're sort of now it's like you need your neighbor to have bad news so that you can bring them good news. So really, it's no longer for your neighbor, it's only for you. You're doing it for yourself. I need my neighbor to be suffering so that I can help them not suffer. And then I feel better about my sense of purpose in the world. And that's that. Now you turn your neighbor into an object or a tool. You dehumanize them. They're no longer a human being that you're in relationship with.
Well, given this conversation, so what do you say to not only pastors, but leaders of the church, individuals that make up the congregation? What do you say to a congregation that you know is, or my congregation is, seeing that serving the community is my church coming up with more programs? We also know from Barna and some other places that less than, I think it's 18% of any congregational membership are involved in any given project or program. And yet, if I could get 18% as a pastor to come to a Bible study, I think that's phenomenal. But what I don't realize is 82% are being untouched by it. But everybody goes to work. Everybody goes out into their community. So what do you say? I mean, aren't we just organized not to do what you're saying currently? Is that, I mean, because part of what you're saying is this is a necessity. This isn't a privilege to talk about this movement.
Right. It's a necessity now, I think.
Yeah, it's a necessity now. And how do we talk among ourselves who are locked into the previous? Because you're asking a kind of change that's transformational. You're not talking about some adjustment to a new way of programming. You're asking us to change the assumptions by which we do our work, which is a definition of transformation, is not just changing the outside, but so how do you address that with many of us who are active people in our congregations, also getting tired of just trying to rev up one more time, try to get more people to come to church, and we know that that's not working. But
right. Yeah, I Christina's really good at asking this question of our partner congregations, which is like, if you're going to do this work, what are you going to give up so that you can do this work? Because when I first started working on this public church idea, it was around youth ministry, and what we quickly realized was that the public church work that we're doing isn't another program that you add into your catalog of programs, like, oh, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this, or I could do this public church thing. But really, it really is culture change for the congregation. It's inviting the congregation into the slow, hard work of wondering what God's up to in our location, and inviting your people into the process of wondering together what God is up to in their location.
Yeah.
And
Christina, can you
jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that there are ways that our congregations are already being church in their places that with greater intentionality and maybe a shift of kind of certain curious questions that we're planting amongst one another, that we can take things we're already doing and actually bring more intentionality to this kind of posture of like a neighbor-oriented way of thinking about being church. So we have another church in our project these last few years who had been doing a community meal once a week in their congregation for neighbors. And they were scratching their heads for the first year with us, like, how are we going to talk to our neighbors? How are we going to practice accompaniment? And then COVID hit, and their weekly meal turned into a drive-by, and their participation in the community, probably quadrupled.
A drive-through, so people driving through to pick up the meals. And then they began to see how much more of the neighborhood they were able to encounter in this way that they were already serving the community. And so they started bringing a different intentionality around, where are we hearing bad news? Where are we hearing good news? They started offering, like, if you would like someone to pray with you, if you'd like to, share prayer requests with our church, we can listen to that. And just in this way, they were already in relationship with their neighborhood. They started building in more intentional, curious questions about what God was up to there, what heartache was there, and then that equipped them to be able to wonder about their call, their vocational call as a congregation in this time and place. So it's not always about, everything we've been doing, we have to stop so we can pick this new thing up, right? It's a way to think about leaning on the ways that you're already in relationship with folks, and just bringing this a different kind of set of questions, maybe, or intentionality to that work. They saw that the meal distribution as outreach, and in a way it was sort of transactional. Like, people came and we gave them the meal, and then they realized this is a thing we're already doing. We've invested a lot of time and energy in it, and it can become an opportunity for accompaniment. So it was really just a mindset change. And then the way they showed up in that space during the meal distribution changed, and then relationships change.
Yeah. Well, Mark Center, one of the professors of note that he and I become good friends, he's just sent a note here to remind us that how your model describes the important role youth play in the process for change, because they kind of naturally get this movement. They're not a part of that historic, recent history of how the church has found itself encompassed, and he just wanted to underline that. Our time is up. Can you believe it? This goes so quickly, an hour and 15 minutes, and we try to honor the time for everyone. Thank you so very much, both of you, both your very personal introduction at the beginning. I mean, I loved hearing both your stories, and your content is just very significant. It's a weighty amount of ideas and thoughts that I can't wait to pursue with you more in these coming weeks. I do want to remind everybody too that, and maybe we haven't talked about this, Christina and Jeremy, but maybe we do a little briefing at the beginning of kind of what we did the previous week, so people who are going to join us and miss it don't have to feel like they've just got left out of the process, because it looks like it's pretty easy to do that because you've laid it out this time, and now we're going to be working with that anyway. I want to remind our listeners and participants today to please extend the link to others or encourage them to sign up, because, as we say, each of these are standalone, but they do build on each other, and that's the artful work that we're asking Jeremy and Christina to do, is to encapsulate a little bit of what's gone on before as you begin something new each week, and that allows new people to enter into this picture. But again, thank you so much for sharing with us and taking the time. We know how exact your work is these days and how busy you are, and for you to take the time to share this with us is very, very special. So with that, we thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to next week. You will get a reminder, and maybe even, I don't know, Amy or Vanna, can we make sure that people who we initially invited to also maybe get a reminder? I don't know what we can do because we have several that weren't able to make it today, like Gary Hessler and others who called in and said, going to a doctor's appointment, but keep me posted, etc. So,
Sure.
any last words, Amy, for you before we?
No, thank you all for being with us. It was great Q&A. Great to hear from Jeremy and Christina. Look forward to our remaining series for the month of November.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, one and all. See you next week.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.